Hello everybody, today is Monday, November 27th. This is Booksy. I'm going to be doing an unusually clickbaity video about AMC possibly going to $14.40 and then dropping down to $1. Now, before I get started here, you need to understand that both of these targets are kind of extreme targets, and they're based on the chart that you see on the screen right now. I'm going to walk through this, and I'm going to tell you a little bit how I kind of found it, but I don't want to get too into that. I just really want to focus on what's being presented here. And I want to give you a reasonable case for how a short operator might be getting this down to $1. I know it sounds crazy. I'm kind of the opinion it won't get there. So I'm actually going to take a sort of my mental stance against myself is that I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be a lot more shallow than that, but I do think that there's a strong chance that if this does pan out the way that I think it's going to go mirrored wise, that you could see definitely like $4.90 down to the $3 area. And interestingly, a long time ago I had a $3.50 target and then later found on a combo chart that $1 target where it was like, it seemed unheard of, right? And everybody at the time was like, psh, this ain't going to $1. There's no way that's going to happen. And then it actually did drop. It ended up dropping, and that combo chart did come down. It never quite got down to $1 until after the reverse split. But if it had existed, you would have seen that continuation. It probably would have gotten to that target. Now, this is not the same chart anymore. This is a different chart. And I know a lot of people, I can hear it now, okay? There's going to be two main arguments, well, three maybe, that are used. Number one is AMC is not going to come back up. It's going down right now. It's going to keep going down. It has to hit a low first, then it's going to come back up. Well, it already hit the sixes, and it already dropped below the previous bottom, which was around, like, in my opinion, like 733. But then, of course, the low at that point being like 705. It's already come below that. So it's changed in some manner from what I had before, which was I thought I was going to bounce early, then go down after for a spring. And I think this is more of a possible setup for a larger range distribution. And that's not going to be pleasant for a lot of people to hear. There is a bullish side to this. It's not one-sided. Okay, so one of the things that people are going to say is, well, no, it's not going to go up to $14.40. It can't happen. Look, it's an extreme target, okay? But I'm going to make a case for it anyways. I'm going to talk about why I think it's possible right here. Number two, you're going to have people saying, well, there's no way it's going to $1. That's way undervalued. It's already undervalued. There's no way. They can't bring it down that far. It's not possible. Blah, 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 blah. Look, at one point in the history of this chart, AMC was at $1.92, and it was being driven down. And even though it held at those levels at $1.92, I think you could go back to that particular time and say that that was undervalued. And then it went up to $72. And you could easily make the argument that that was way overvalued. So it had some pretty massive swings in its lifetime. And we're going to be looking mostly at just a macro chart today. I'm really not interested in looking at anything below the 4 hour. Because for this particular setup, and what I'm going to talk about today, it doesn't even really apply. And I think that when you look at the micro, yeah, you can look at a range and you can go level to level. And that's ultimately like how I think it's best to trade AMC, is looking at it level to level, not trying to make up giant macro schematics. But big picture, there is a huge narrative going on right now. I think you need to look at the massive big picture. The last thing I'm going to hear from people, I don't know if that was three, but first is like, can't possibly, go up. It's bearish. It's got to go down further. It hasn't hit the low target. Second is it can't go down. There's no possible way it's going to go down below, X number. You pick it, right? Because that's not accurate to the market value and blah, 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 blah. And I would just say to that, well, fundamentally, this thing's been all over the map in terms of market value. I mean, it's been literally like super low to super high, right? In terms of valued, undervalued, overvalued, all that stuff. So when we look at that, I'm not going to talk about the fundamentals of it. I'm just going to show you the technical setup for it, okay? The last thing that a lot of people are going to critique here, and I have to critique it myself, but the last big thing that folks are going to critique is they're going to say the chart doesn't work. They're going to say because of the reverse split, the chart is inaccurate. This chart has been messed up ever since ape was introduced. Like, so messed up that I went out and burned a lot of bridges talking about it. I'm going to cut to the point here, okay? This is kind of a stretch, but it is working. And I think that the fact that the chart shift did happen, the fact that they're still adhering to, by they, I'm talking about institutional traders, they're still adhering to really long-term trends and creek lines, that to me indicates that this setup was partially designed. And I don't think that the drop-off here with the volume that is here is necessarily something you should just ignore because, oh, well, there's a reverse split, it's a new stock now, it's completely different. I don't think it is, okay? I still think there's a whole lot of evidence that we are still experiencing a lot of consistency with trends. One on the screen right now, this really like fancy looking rainbow, right, which is just a Fibonacci channel. So I'm not gonna sit here and like argue that I think that it's still connected, but I think it's still connected, okay? And that's gonna have to be the presumption that's made here. Look, I understand that I like wiped my own channel because I said, you know, this is a really different stock now. There's too much stuff that's happened to it. I think some things, RSI is a big one that could be kind of messed up right now. I think on balance volume has to be screwed up. I don't see how it could possibly be right. I think that when you're looking at liquid levels, when you're looking at the VRVP, we do it all the time on this channel. Those are going to be skewed because they don't include any of the trading that happened on Ape during that 12-month stint that Ape existed right here. You know, so there's just all kinds of things that kind of raise the eyebrow. But one thing we can say for sure is that the value of AMC stock, if you've been holding this, has drastically dropped, right, since 72. It's been essentially like a reverse squeeze. Well, recently, I had noticed that there were some trends that seemed to be following pretty well. And I went back and I looked at this particular trend right here. And this is kind of where I'm getting to the point, okay? This particular downtrend that you see this 27-degree angle, this has been a really common theme for AMC. It's basically walked down this same angle every single time it's walked down. And whether or not this is the same operator now as it was then, it doesn't matter. It's the same angle. Like, it's still being walked down. And by down, I'm looking at this chart. You guys are like, what are you talking about? Upside down, right? These flags, as they have appeared, have all been basically the exact same trajectory. And then if you look at the big picture and you look at ultimately with after hours on, extended hours on, you can see that there's a really consistent, and I'm going to make it yellow so you can see the two yellow ones, okay? There's a very consistent channel here, okay, that has existed ever since 72. And if you look at the top of that, when the buy button was removed in January, and you look at the top where we hit on like June 2nd or whatever it was, when we hit the highs near 72, those two marks set up this channel that has been consistently tested. And if you look at the midpoint between those channels, it's essentially like the exact, I mean, I don't even need to like walk through it with you. I think you can visually see it, but you can see that this is the walk down. So each one of these walks has ultimately been what? Well, it's essentially just been a walk through this midline. And sometimes, as you can see on some of these larger examples, sometimes it's like a 50% cross right across that midline. And you can see that early on in these kind of bigger distributive moves that we're basically doing like a 50% jump. We're going from one side to the other. This is essentially just a sine wave that's wrapping its finger around this downtrend that matches these much larger ones. Now you notice I'm saying downtrend because, and this is where it's kind of confusing, is if you flip the stock upside down, you're looking at it the right way, you're kind of like, well, wait a minute. You keep saying downtrend, but the visual looks like an uptrend. Remember, I'm flipping it upside down, and there's a reason for that. Because I noticed that this particular trend here, beginning and end of it, you can see where the beginning and end of it is. This particular trend here has some strange mirroring that's going on. The first thing that I noticed when I took this and I duplicated it is I noticed that we haven't tested this yet. This yellow line here where that buy button removal happened, that would be the bottom of that main channel. You'll notice we haven't come close to it. Now, if we were to leave right now, it would be around 15.50. If we were to leave a little bit later, you can see that the price would be dropping as you go. But ultimately, yeah, you could be coming back here. If it were, for example, around the next earnings in March, you could be coming here and it'd be basically gap filling up here at 12 to retest that trend. Do you have to retest it? In my opinion, you probably would. Most of the time when we drop a major trend like this, you're going to retest it. Likewise, when you go backwards even further and you look at these kind of parallels as they go, you can see that this one right here is almost equal parts away from the other two. This is sort of a middle channel that's only really been explored in that January run. And if you notice that when it came underneath here, yeah, early on it's like pushing higher. So there's that. But look way back. And you can see that it actually goes all the way back to the original distribution start in 2016. And it doesn't respect it again, not strongly, until about 2019. So from 2016 into early 2017, when it gets back to this point, it really jumps over it, and it looks like it's assuming like a higher trend here. But then you notice it starts breaking down, and it once again assumes the lower trend. And look at where this ultimately, this accumulation tops and where it bottoms. Right? When it comes back down to test, it is that same trend, the very trend that we're talking about on the top here from the two peaks. So when I look at this on the big picture, I'm kind of like, all right, so there's basically like a cat ear here, and then there's the two paws, one right here, one right here. So we're looking at a major breakdown, right, of this sine wave right here. And the bigger picture of the sine wave, if I were to draw it, and I'm going to do my best to not butcher this. The bigger picture would be something along these lines like this, okay? All right. Now, I know I'm sort of skipping some early points, but there's a reason for that. It's kind of like that. And mainly, the reason for that is I'm trying to give you like that visual clarity of like, oh, there's the 2 years. And what you normally see on AMC is that the sine waves, I talked about this a little in the other video, is that the sine waves usually point to ultimately like where is your spring going to be. Now this guy is kind of interesting. It depends on how you draw it. I'm just kind of loosely drawing it right now along this center, and you can see that it is heavily respected. There's a lot of places where there's takeoffs, there's resistance, there's support. Not perfect. Not perfect by any means. And I think if we lower it to where you see this guy cross and you see these double cat ears, you can see it's even stronger with the takeoff being here. And look at where we are right now. We're kind of like sitting on it. You know what I mean? It's sitting up pretty high. The secondary one is this guy. And this guy is a little harder to draw. You can do the same kind of thing here where you're sort of finding that middle point. I think it's also very close. It could be right here, right? Where we've kind of tested it. I talked about this in the video this morning. You could make it a little bit higher. It could be assuming more of this angle because of this guy, this double touch that happened in March and April of 2023, in which case, again, you're kind of looking at, well, are we basically at the end? Now, that begs the question then, Booksy, what is the point of all this stuff you're talking about right now? If we're basically at the end of this, doesn't it mean that we're just going to come down a little bit more to like 590 and then just take off, and that's that, and this is your whole thing? Possibly, It also means that this could be a crucial point of breakdown, because if you were to break down beneath that at some point, you're basically flip-flopping around this massive downward motion, and you can see that this would be a humongous drop down to $1. And it seems unreasonable at first until you think about this as like widening. And if you think about this as a gigantic widening that is going to come back up and retest 15, all of a sudden it looks like crap. This could be like a huge S-curve down to $1. Okay? And breaking down beneath something like this, an intersection of creeks would basically put you underneath both and could start a massive long-term distribution. Again, you're going to look at that and sort of critique me right away and say, yeah, I don't think that's what's going to happen. But the big picture is that we're basically sitting right along what would either be a spring or a massive drop, okay? if you're just looking at this as like a normal sine wave setup. Now, here comes the crazy part. So I took this, you guys are like, that's crazy enough. I took this a step further, and what I started doing is looking at these parallels, particularly coming backwards. A lot of people have been talking about this like a reverse squeeze, and I started thinking about that almost literally, and I noticed that these 2 points are like really the same. If you look at that parallel, right, that we were just talking about, these are the only 2 times it touches it. It happens in extended hours in both cases where it comes a little higher, and then this one comes up to the top. And you can see here that they track along this bottom, and this is really the only 2 times these are actually touched. And then look at the immediate reaction in both cases. In this case, this is coming in from bottom up, right? We know this is the big run into June. In this case, it's dropping. But I want you to notice where it stops. And this is where things get sort of weird, okay? Because I took the same parallels and I was like, well, wait a minute. Look at where they're stopping right now. Notice that where they both stop is the same spot. And not only that, but then look at the next spot up. I'm just kind of picking colors here so you can see. But notice that in both cases, the stopping points for these are identical. In fact, it's almost like somebody is unwinding a position or initiating a short squeeze, or I should say a bull squeeze in the opposite direction. So you can see that coming out of this, it's essentially the exact same, but in reverse, and it's matching up with those parallels. Now, if I hadn't initially drawn out the parallels, I don't think I would have assumed that this was some kind of a mirroring. So before you jump the gun and say, well, you just see what you want to see, I don't think so. I think that what I was looking at specifically was these trends, right? I looked at after hours. First, I looked at this channel, and I was like, that's weird. I remember there being something like this, and I took this channel, and I said, well, let's see if it plays out the same way. Let's see if it actually does the same thing. Does it test this channel? And it does, right, on the way up. Now, this takes a minute to get there, and it ends up being that, hey, wait a minute, you can draw the same exact channel to these markers, right, and do it in reverse. So that's the weird thing about this, is I started looking at this like, well, wait a minute, well, what would this be, right? So this would be like your top or whatever. Let's start putting it back. And sure enough, you know, as you can tell, there's some inconsistency here with the way I've drawn it. And I recognize that. And I'm not going to be able to get into all the details of why I did it that way. But I want to just point out that, like, both of these run a symmetrical channel, essentially backwards. And if you notice, like, the count here from the bottom, it'd be 1, 2, right, 3. So it's basically like a corrective phase. This looks like a 1, 2, but it's missing a 3. So the 3 would be the next corrective phase. Okay, so what are you trying to say, Booksy? Well, what I'm trying to say right now is that if you then look at the next step, it's starting to look, again, eerily very similar, albeit not identical. It's starting to look really, really similar. Now, here's the things that are going to get people kind of like raising their eyebrows, because here's where we talk about interpretation and whether or not this is even possible, okay? So notice that this is widening. If you're looking at it backwards, it's a widening of sorts. It's actually more of a narrowing, right? But in our case, it's widening. We're quite literally, it seems like we're quite literally doing the same thing in reverse, okay? But this is where things get a little different, because unlike back here, I don't think there's a buy button removal in the works or a sell button removal in the works. So I don't think it's going to do the exact same thing. Do I think this is a triangle and that it's narrowing and then breaking down? Yes. So if we were looking at this in like a mirror world, we would be looking at this as a widening. Is it widening currently? And the answer is yeah. Yeah, it is. It is widening currently. It started down here, right? And obviously we don't have enough points to absolutely confirm this yet. But similar things have happened. We did the same thing back here in March, for example. And I'm going to do my best to not like mess up this chart too much. I want it to be as clean as possible while we're talking. So I might delete some things in just a minute. But notice that in March, we did something similar with this push down, and then we came up and made a new low, right? I'm still in reversal world here, right? And that's very similar to what we're seeing right now. And then we ultimately pushed all the way back up and followed that trend to what? Well, till we got to the top of that widening ultimately. Right now, the top of our widening, if you look at it, where does it intersect? Where does it intersect the trend that we supposedly haven't tested on the macro, right? Where the buy button removal was right here. We ultimately haven't really touched it since these two bottoms. And when we broke out, we didn't test it. Where does that go? And you can see there's an intersection that's in the near future. It's very close. And that would be right over here around 1440, right? Where it intersects. When I looked at this particular part, yes, the Fibonacci extension there does seem to suggest that it's about the exact same area. There's a three-way intersection here. Okay. When I looked at the trajectory then in and out, same deal. I took that trajectory, mirrored it on the other side. Trajectory in this case down, although it's reversed, and then trajectory back up. Once again, we're getting kind of an intersection. And this is not something that I look at lightly. If I have like a 1, 2, 3, 4-way intersection of possible ideas here that makes sense, I think it's a strong enough target to bring it to people's attention. Now, we haven't actually hit what would be considered then the low if we're going to actually double bottom on this particular guy. But the thing is, if we were to double bottom on this, it's like the 590s, or it's like $6 on the dot, right? If we were just drop right now, okay? And I know some people are going to look at this and say, yeah, but Booksy, even if this is a widening, this could be an S-curve, in which case you still expect this thing, I still expect this thing to go down to $4 or $5 even, and then reverse, maybe, maybe. Yeah, I don't think that's impossible. And I think that there's a strong enough case to say that, sure, that could happen. But it technically has already made a lower low. So at this point, if it reverses, it reverses. I'm not going to look at it and say, well, it has to come down lower. Well, I don't know that, In this particular case, this was a very dramatic example, right? And this obviously hits another marker here that in our particular time would be way down here at like $3.50 if this were to just go as the crow flies straight that direction. We don't see a lot of evidence that that would happen based only on that S-curve. It doesn't look like it go that low. It looks like it maybe go to 5, but not way up here at like 350, right? Well, we don't know yet. This is how it happened in this particular time. Thus far, it's been meeting up pretty closely to those levels. I mean, like we were talking about a minute ago, and I kind of just like went off to talk about the other things, but this is very much like the same. I always lose where this thing is. And you can see that it comes below this red line and then pushes back down. And it's very similar to what happened here. So we haven't tested this yet. We haven't tested this mark yet. I think it's right at 6. I think that it would be a pretty big leap to say it has to go there. When I looked at local stuff this morning, I didn't feel like that was the case. I didn't feel like that was the most likely thing, okay? It looked more like something like this, where you might make a lower low like we are, and then reverse and come back up. Also, I just mentioned it, based on trajectory, it works. Right now, it's effectively pointing towards mid-December as like that's when you could possibly hit a high and come back down. If you to continue to go down, yeah, if it's super steep, it might still work, but if it continues at the same trajectory, it doesn't work. You no longer have a chance of getting up to this point and touching this at the same time. Now, how necessary is that, Booksy? Well, I think it's pretty necessary. I think when you look at the big picture here and you look at how many times these kind of intersections have happened, they're not happenstance. When you look and you observe and you see like, well, when I go back here and I look at this kind of creek test, we'll look at right where it intersects this top, It went away from it like as if it were going to just leave, and then it drops, and in our case it went up, hit that intersection. This is including extended hours. Look how perfectly it matches right where those intersect. I'm not talking about this line going out, that's me. I'm talking about this major creek right here that was established as a support and resistance line, and that's exactly where it intersects that main line. This is not something that I think of very lightly. So when I look at the future and I'm considering the fact that, well, in the future we could see something like that happen, it's one of two things. It's either this bottom or this top, right? We don't know yet exactly how it gets there. It could be a lot longer, but timing wise, hey, it's still within this channel. It makes sense to me. I do think that we just talked about it a minute ago. I do think there's a parallel here, right? So we can look at those things and we can make considerations and say, sure, I think it's possible that, if I'm off, that it could be a later on kind of thing where it's coming up and meeting this guy instead out here in January. And it's more or less a little lower at like 14, 13, okay? Either one of those works fine because you can see that this is essentially, if you look at this in reverse, this is like a preliminary support or preliminary supply in reverse, right? But in our reality, it's preliminary support. We haven't tested it yet. So this trend right here, this downtrend, is heading towards retesting of this support/supply area, support/resistance area. We haven't tested it yet. We're getting a bit of a widening now because we came lower. That's where the slingshot happens and you push down. When you look at a 50% move, a 50-50 move, and you look at the centermost point of these ranges, once again, it's kind of like a mixed bag. You could make a case to say this has to come to like 550 before it can move, but I think you could also make a pretty strong case that it's already come low enough. If you look at the overall picture here and you say, let's say it did start right now, well, I mean, that's kind of like right in the middle. It's 950 looks like the 50% marker, and that's right where the high liquidity is. I mean, I don't have it pulled up right now, but we could pull it up, and you could take a look for yourself, and you can see that we have high liquidity right here, and we zoom in closer, we can see that the next place where we have the highest amount of trading is right here along that 950 ridge, right? So it really just depends on how you measure it, and I think that either one is a probable outcome. Like they give you the same kind of result, and that would be like a massive S curve to the upside, right? Where you have kind of a middle right here, probably along this red line, right? And then you break down. So we have these kind of conceptually in our mind. We have these places that are most likely for these things to occur. So where are we going next? Are we going to go to 550? Are we going to find support and push back up? Are we going to push up then go down? Those questions are almost irrelevant to the bigger question, which is, would we eventually get to $1? Now, I've been kind of making like loop-to-loop arguments here, but the main argument is really, really simple, which is that right now, and I'm in upside down land, this kind of looks like a long-term bearish play, right, to essentially come up to this particular level, right, retest this 76 mark, which is where this breakdown occurred. Notice that this is right where, if you look at the current chart, this is right where it took off for the June run. So we've essentially erased the whole June run now, and now we've essentially erased the whole January run. But oddly, again, I know this is kind of speculative, oddly, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, does that mean that it's going to continue to do this? Well, here's where the bear case for $1 comes in. If this were to mirror outward perfectly, essentially we would drop to like some ridiculous low number like 350. We would reverse and come all the way back up. It seems ludicrous, right? We would reverse and come all the way back to 14 something, and then we would go flying in basically a 50-50 sprint across that midline right here, right in the middle around 350, and we come all the way to what? Well, $1. Weirdly, this is very close. If you look at the intersection of the next particular point, which is the same thing, these are just parallels, right, to this particular bottom. This parallel that comes all the way back to that original low at 192, which now says like 10 or whatever. If you look at where that intersects this particular trend right here that I've got drawn, right, which we have two really strong touch points on, it actually intersects exactly at $1. So the channel itself is 100% built if it needs to mirror outward, it's 100% built to get you to $1. Like, it could easily do it. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but you're kind of like fudging the lines. Look, in this particular case, this came over that channel line as well, in my opinion. Okay? I don't think that it's necessary to be like ultra precise necessarily with these particular points, because these are, if you remember in reverse, these aren't like the strongest points of this channel. Now, if you were to draw them like that, you might see something a little different. It may look more like a narrowing, like a huge wedge going upward. This is what I think a lot of folks have attested to in the past. I don't think it's wrong necessarily that this could be like a massive, more of a massive narrowing. But what I am doing is I'm using what channel does exist, this particular 1, 2, 3 hit line with the cross, and I'm using that as a parallel. From that point forward, do your own DD. You know, if you want to go back and you want to see like, well, where, you know, what does this top give you? What does this top give you? Which one do I think is right? Fine, that's fine. I don't particularly think there's a wrong answer here. I think it's just that this sets up a channel, and then you've got a 1, 2, 3 major correction type deal. So major correction meaning that that is not a bullish move, but it's actually a correction against a bearish move potentially. Now, when I go to the weekly here, it's going to erase extended hours. So there's going to be some things that don't match up. But this is where things, to me, get pretty interesting, okay? Because when I look at this, I could see how a bear could easily argue that this is some kind of a spring bottom. Because we had essentially like a 2-touch here, and then we ran up to a top. We broke out what could be considered like an SOS for a bear, and then we came all the way back down to the bottom of the range. I think regardless of what you argue, you can't argue with the fact that eventually this recaptured that bottom. And ultimately, when did that happen? It happened in March. That if you look at this from the bearish point of view, this is essentially like the spring where you could load up on put positions. This is the breakout, and then this is the retest. Is it a spring? Is it a phase B bottom? That's the bigger question here I can't really answer. If it's a phase B bottom, where this is like a major move to the upside, and then you've got a phase B, this particular move already came over the top. It could be that this is a giant double-headed distribution. Yeah, and then eventually you're going to come back the other way, and that's more of the bull case. I'm not going into that right now. I'm not. I think that on the whole, when I look at this, I would, if I were going to consider this to be bullish long-term, which I think is fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I would probably be looking at marking this off somehow along this particular trend from this first bottom through. Right there, you see this like a head and shoulder almost coming through here. And I would be using that shoulder mark roughly going through like 50%. And I would say like that's probably like the ultimate, you know, upward trajectory of some massive thing. I'm not going to make that decision for you though, because right now, if this is some kind of an SOS above the top, right, you're in for it. And if you notice, like right here, this essentially was a retest on that top. So if it were to drop, if it were to pop here, right, and it already has, already made a new low, it's kind of like either one of two things, right? It's either doing a little sign of strength and it's going to continue along this area, or it's about to do a distributive move. Again, we're in the upside down land where this pushes and then drops, and we're really going back to check this preliminary support, which again, upside down kind of looks like prelim supply. Okay. Now, the reason why this is kind of strange is I'm getting a little bit stuck here myself, because I'm kind of looking at this thing like with the lens of a bear and a bull and trying to determine what I think is most likely. If it's just going to mirror outward, this is going to $1. But if I'm looking at it from the point of view of like, well, I don't necessarily think this holds. This is definitely some kind of a trend that hooked right here, right? I don't think this trend necessarily holds. So I don't think it's necessarily going to go all the way up to $1. That's definitely where it would go if it continues to mirror outward on this kind of inverse squeeze. And before you say like there's no way that could happen, again, I need you to like remember that if the goal here of an operator was to unwind a position, right, and to get to this place where you could basically have this like massive move. Doing it the way that it was done would mean that you'd have to do a huge count. Remember, the count here was like going upward to like 20 some odd bucks. The original count here was something that was very, very significant, because it meant that if it did break to the upside, we could see a humongous move, right? And I don't know the P&F count in reverse here, but I'm pretty sure it's like $1, right? It's like really low. So if you don't think it's possible based on, I don't know, like the idea of it being too low, I know I'm kind of jumping around here. I just want to make a point that I can't even find it. Oh, it's right here. It's because it's all the way down. I just want to make a point that we already had a P&F for this whole area. It was pretty big. This is a long term. And notice like the pickup that happened here in volume right before the move. And if bears had quote unquote accumulated short positions this whole time, or went short here, they've got a lot of ammunition. And at the time, we were thinking this thing could basically go back up to here. So it was a significant move. I mean, it was essentially like coming back up towards the top, at least up to like here near 15, if it broke the right direction for the bulls, and it did not. But you can see how like in reverse, that is equally dangerous. It's a 490% move. And I think we've already kind of gotten the idea that, you know, it's not going to be exactly 1-to-1, but that's a lot of ammunition, basically. That time versus move is really important. Could it already be done? Maybe, you know, and this is where things get dicey. Like, this is where this whole thing can fall apart, because while this to me does look like a possible, you know, spring into an SOS, I think that there could be, on the reverse side, right? I think there could be a strong case that, well, it still need to come back down, you know, and check this and that level and all this other stuff, or it has the possibility that this is the actual spring. If you flip it upside down, you know, you might say, well, wait a minute, this could be the spring, and then it reverses and comes back up. I think that's why this 1440 to me looks so particularly appealing, because the idea of this mirroring outward, getting to $1 is diabolical, right? And the fact that it dropped from here, yeah, we might already be at that point where it's about to reverse, but if it's going to do this big flush, it would need to then flush above the floor. The floor right now is sitting up here at like 11 something. And you can see that we barely kind of flushed above it. You know, we tested it. Wouldn't this be something, you know, to see it rip all the way up into mid-December and then have a massive drop afterwards? Again, I'm not saying that this is what should happen or this is what exactly will happen. I am saying that there's a pretty strong case here. If you look at this particular downtrend from way back in July, notice where it goes. It goes to our intersection. When you look at the trend upward, it goes to our intersection. When you look at where that preliminary support / supply was, depending on which direction you're looking at it, upside down or whatever. And I know what you guys are thinking. It's supply is always the same. Demand's always the same. Why are you confusing the terms? I'm just saying, flip up chart upside down, okay, and it kind of changes your perspective. Again, it's this intersection right here in the 14s. And everything about that would indicate that you could potentially see it hold above 11 if it came back down, rehold this trend, and then essentially it's a spring for the bulls, or drop, and then it becomes a massive, massive distribution, right, to the downside. And this is where you get the danger, I suppose, of coming down to $1 long term, which I know a lot of people are going to kind of mock and say it's never going to happen, and you're wrong. I'm going to get thumbs down just because of that. I'm telling you that I think there's a strong technical case for it. And when you look at the volume going into this buy-in here, and then the amount of time that was spent potentially building up short positions over the last 2 years, especially this last like 12 months or so of basically just sideways, when you look at that and then you see the volume coming down, I understand this is like massively high volume. I understand this could be a spring. I agree. I think if it comes back up to $14 or $15 and then it holds 11, it's probably a spring, right? And even if it didn't hold 11, but it still held like $8 and then it came up again, could still be a spring. But I will say right now, in my opinion, there's a strong amount of evidence pointing to this being potentially, right? Potentially a massive inverse of what we've already experienced, and that this offset is really just, that's what it is. This offset is set up in a way that it's currently mirroring outward in a really spooky way, right? And if it continues to do that, then the ultimate price target would indeed be $1. And not surprisingly, I know it's kind of like a moot point, but not surprisingly, it's roughly around where the next earnings is that could possibly happen. Now, I can't really say for sure with timing beyond what I've already kind of talked about, whether or not this is even possible or likely to get there at that particular time out in February. Do I also think it's possible this breaks out, holds 11, and then continues upward? Sure. In which case, I think we'd be coming up to that $45 area. And that's about as high as I could see it going at first, at least, going into earnings. I can't imagine it coming up higher than that. But if that were to occur, obviously we've been looking at then where does it find support after that. It still could be a really long-term, year-long kind of thing, probably going into the election here, where you have a similar bottom, right? With a push up and then, big LM cross or whatever, and then it comes up again and does it again. That's bullish as all get out. But the bearish setup here is pretty nasty. It would basically look a lot like what happened here in March, albeit on much more volume. Very, very similar in that it could have that massive spike and then just come bleeding down through. Another reason why this kind of, I don't want to say appeals to me, it sounds like I'm being like really down on it, but another reason why this seems likely to me to some degree is that, and I mentioned it before, is that this kind of reminds me of the same thing. We're seeing that on the big picture, you have this massive kind of correlation, right, to what occurred up here during this distribution that happened. And ultimately, when it dropped, it did come back up eventually and check that level that it dropped off of. Well, this was back when we were in like 72 down to 35. Remember that? And then it dropped, and then it came back up and checked it later in March, and that ends up being the big back test. This is a very, very similar setup if you look at it carefully. And so the idea of it dropping off a particular level and then coming back up to check that level, well, it's happened before, right, in a number of ways. And in this particular case, the back test to go check that goes all the way back up to, where that drop off really started happening over here. And in our case, I think it would be pretty high, but the thing is we're on a slope. So like all of this stuff matters to me because I'm like, well, if it's set up horizontally, this would be really different. Like if this is set up horizontally, I think everybody would probably be in agreement on like what it is as like some kind of a macro. This is kind of what the mother of all charts was about a long time ago, was like it was some kind of a macro build out. So if this had come sideways and done this, I think a lot more people would be looking at it like, oh snap, it's just a giant version. You can see it, right? Like it's just a giant version of this guy. I mean, it's essentially like identical, right? And I think everybody would be saying the same thing. We already knew it was shrinking. We had talked about this for a long time, right? That it was a shrinking iteration going this way, and we didn't know which direction it might break. So if it had gone sideways, I think we would all be anticipating something like that, right? Where this is either like a midway point, unfortunately, right? Where you're going to drop down really low and you're about to get this kind of business, where it pumps up, but maybe it doesn't go as high as it should, and then it comes sideways and drops. Or you've already done that, and you're really on this bottom, and you're getting ready. You've already done like the major move. You're on this bottom. You're bouncing. You're getting ready to go push up. In which case, yeah, I think there could be an argument at that particular point. And this is where things are completely subjective. You can determine it however you want. Whether it comes up higher or not, I don't really know if it matters. I think the back test is here. That's what I'm trying to say is I think it's still 15. Like the idea of this coming up and checking that level, you might look at this and say, well, shouldn't it be way up here? Shouldn't it be at like 35, right? That's where we had the support. But this is horizontal. This is diagonal, right? So the diagonals here indicate and support the original thesis, which I'm presenting to you, which is that I think a back test would likely come to this kind of golden line. And if it did come higher, and I guess it could, if it did come higher, I wouldn't put it past where it found support over here, ultimately. You can see this is where there's dips, and this is the two major dips that happen, but most of the support is found here on the upper line. And this is kind of where I'm going to sort of end the video today, is that I think that there's a strong chance that if this reaction happens within the next couple of weeks, that we're going to end up somewhere between this 1440 and maybe 19 at the highest. That's pretty high, right? It just depends on how fast it goes. And I think that's pretty much it. I don't think you would expect it to come back above. That's the main test. It's going back to checking that channel, right, that we lost, that we were in for 2 years. It's the same test that happens here when we first enter that channel, which is that it's established as kind of the main trend, right, coming up here. That's where it's going to be. And then that ends up being where we kind of lock in. So the back test seems a bit redundant, whether you're bearish or bullish, like it should happen. Okay. All right. Well, that's great, Booksy. I don't really like any of this because you're not talking a lot about racing up to 45 anymore, and you're not talking about long-term going way up. I don't necessarily think that this is how it's going to play out, okay? I think this is an idea. I think it's a pretty strong idea based on everything I've presented. I don't necessarily think it's the only idea, and I definitely don't think that a lot of people are going to agree with it. Like, they're going to think it's not possible. They're going to think I'm ridiculous, that it's already kind of hit the bottom, it needs to hit, or really it just needs to get down to this lower golden line at like 350, and then it's going to take off. I don't know for a fact one way or another that it's going to work out, this way or that way. What I do know is that if it's mirroring outward, and it definitely seems to be based on these two hits and then the reactive move down, that we will probably see a reaction up to the 15 to 16 area, and then we will start seeing a greater breakdown. And if the breakdown only goes to the threes, great. Maybe it doesn't ever go any lower. You know what I mean? If the breakdown catches early and turns back around and it holds then above 11, maybe that's it. It's just a macro spring right here, and the bulls were right. We're going to head back up, and then we're going to get some major move, to the upside. And I think if that were to happen, I'm looking at this major retest right here, coming back up, checking this area, in the future. And absolutely, I think that's possible. A lot of it will depend on your market outlook. So if you think that if you think the market is going to push all-time highs and then start dumping, you're probably more likely to believe that AMC would do something like that as well. Like, it might have a rally here somewhere between 9 something and 14, even if you were being really conservative, right? And that maybe you're right, Booksy, maybe by January or mid-December, it can get up to like these levels, and then it's going to rocket down because the whole market's going to sell off. Okay, but if you're of the opinion that, no, I think we're going to go up, bears are going to get trapped because they're going to think it's going to come down, we're going to go to all-time highs, create an SOS, or we're just going to do a backup and then reverse, you're going to have a very different opinion about the future of AMC. Does that make sense? So right now, a lot of folks are going to look at this and say, well, I think it's going to break out and go to all-time highs. And I would generally say, yeah, I think it's probable that it happens. It might back up first and then go. It's probable that it happens, And then what? Well, if at that point, it's like that 2008 thing where you're going to see it sell off again. We're going to come back down and get these lows. We're going back down to 350s again. I mean, long term, that's where the range is. I mean, you look at this. This is where the setup is for preliminary supply, and then we push up. And then we have the breakdown, you find support. If this is a phase B kind of support, then you've still got a long ways to go. You know, you can see a high and then come back down and get a spring. You know what I mean? You don't have to. You could come back down and catch in the middle, and it could never go below, 390. But as a big range, there's a lot of possibilities here. So just because it comes up to all-time highs doesn't mean it's going to run forever. It means that, hey, you could have a giant, M-top. And this is very similar to what happened in that 2008 drop. A lot of people have made those comparisons, but remember, it had that early rally, so it came back down. I mean, it's almost one-to-one. I mean, there's a corrective measure that happened, came down, found support, pushed up, rallied, got all the way up to all-time highs, slightly higher, and then had a major drop. And then you got a spring action, right, where it dropped below the support, and then it reversed, and then you started back to the upside eventually, coming up and SOSing over the top. This is a much smaller version of the same concept, but certainly possible, right? A lot of this stuff is probably going to boil down to, in my opinion, November of 2024. The election, I think, is going to be a great determinant. So I think we have a lot of time to come up and then drop all the way back down by the election season. And so if that happens, and if that is the case for the market on the whole, and we end up down at 340s or whatever, maybe around, the election season, where do you think AMC is going to be, right? Like, those are the questions that I think are really important. Does this end up being bullish or bearish long term? I think a lot of it's going to be determined on your outlook, right, on the whole. But I think on the whole, again, I just think it's a really interesting case. I don't necessarily think, I know people don't like me saying stuff like this, but I don't necessarily think it's going to happen the way I'm saying it's going to happen. I just think that it's a fascinating case. It needs to be shared, that there's a possibility here, right, that we're going to see something between these two trends, right, here and here, and then we will see. It may be that because this is the creek line, and this is kind of what I'm trying to hint at with, hey, maybe we don't get to $1, right? It may be because this is the actual creek, right, from back yonder, okay, from over here, that we don't actually ever see. And you guys are like, what? It looks so different now. Well, with extended hours, it changes a little bit of the trajectory of it, so it looks really different. This is the one that goes all the way up to the top with extended hours. Right here, back to the 2016 top. Yeah, it may be that that's where it goes to, and it doesn't ever go lower. And we could see that how that could play out over the course of a year, where you might have this kind of breakdown, right? But it doesn't actually make a 50-50 move to $1, which is kind of low, right? But instead it holds that major creek. And honestly, like, that's kind of where a lot of my TA goes to anyways, is like, where's the next big one? It's way down here, what have we not checked? It's way up here. So we go up first, we check 14s, then we come down and we get really low. And I know this goes against, again, what a lot of folks were expecting, because I was originally feeling really bullish about this area. I just don't think that it's going to do what we want. I think this ends up being a distribution and coming down. I think the early drop here makes me think that that's likely. That it's a weakness, right? It's not strong. It doesn't look like it's going to form a bottom and go up. It looks to me like more of a test down, and then it's going to go up and distribute. I think this is very possible, okay, that we have a really long-term bearish trend going into March, and then ultimately from that point we will see, if it ends up continuing or if it leaves this channel. If it leaves this channel and it does it right now, then we may never come back down, and that's the good thing, is that we don't know the future. It could easily change. We take it level by level, but it gives me a measure at which to look at it. So currently there's a possibility that we see a push up and then another distribution down. So currently, in the short term, I still think it's possible that we see like 9 something and then come lower before we go back up. Now this might be like kind of like confusing because it seems like that's way too much movement, but it just has to do with, again, this idea of like, hey, we might mirror out what we see here, okay, where we get kind of a double tap on the bottom, in which case we may need to come up to 9 first. So this could be a very tumultuous few weeks where we're getting like a huge amount of volatility in swings. We could easily come up to like 9 or 950 or something, and then drop again going into early December, and then rally going into the new year. And those are things that I don't want to confuse anybody, but it's totally possible that there's a big bounce here and then a continuation upward, as opposed to just racing up in like kind of a straightforward manner to the top, right? You could easily see how this would pan out and confuse people, because it would look a lot like that 2020 bottom, and everyone would think, well, it's going to just spring and go. Well, it might if it stays above 11, long term up here, but it also might not if what? Well, we just talked about it. If it breaks down. So I could see how this particular setup presents a lot of possibility for like a longer term, move to come check these major creeks that really haven't been tested in a long time, and this being like a breakdown of it. I think it seems very likely to me. So this is kind of where I'm at right now. I don't like that it's given us such a bearish outlook, but that's the nature of the market as it is. You take it, trade it for what it is and not for what it isn't. And I do think this is a pretty strong case of a huge amount of convergence, early mid-December to early January, going up to like 1550s, and then potentially from there, really seeing it kind of rocket down. Where a lot of folks will be looking at this and saying, well, I think this is where you're going to get that, this is where you're going to get that 2020 bottom. And this is what I was saying before too. But the fact is that this came lower. It came below the range, So unless this is like a double spring, I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. I think it could be that it's meant to look like that, and then we'd have to wait and see if it actually holds over 11. This did hold the creek here. When it came up, held the creek, came up, reaccumulated, and ran again. That's the case that I was making before all this craziness with this inversion that I just talked about, was that I thought it was going to look like 2020 bottom if it came down to 6, and then potentially if it holds here, so let's say it goes up to like 19 or whatever, if it holds here, you could see it kind of cross slower, and this is where you get that kind of January style breakout, and then it goes again, and this is where you get up to 45. But I think that there's an equally strong case based on what we're seeing with a potential inverse squeeze, that this hasn't made the lows that it's going to make yet, and it's ultimately going to make a lot more determination down near the 3s, and then possibly even lower. I mean, I'm just being honest because it's there. It doesn't have to happen. It may seem unreasonable, but it's there, right? I think that the major creek body, is roughly right here, with the higher extension being where I had it before. But this is kind of like the main thing, right? And I think this is still low. It's really low. It's down in the 2s. So if this were to break down, I would think of it a lot like you think of it here with March, where this is like a distribution, and then it comes lower, and then it basically rebuilds and starts coming back up, and eventually, long term, you might see it break up and come back to like 20 something, you know what I mean? And this is where maybe you see a more definite change, where it doesn't do what it did last time. Instead, it continues more sideways and then goes up. And longer term, this is way off in the future, so it's hard to say. But I'm just wanting to point out that this exists. I think it's important to note that this is not the only thing that can happen, but it's definitely pretty compelling and pretty interesting. And I'm going to be keeping a very keen eye on these lower creeks, on these parallels. I think, in my opinion, there's no getting around the parallels. Like, the way that they are drawn, is absolutely tantamount to like what we're experiencing right now. And I think that the fact that we're above the previous quote unquote top, right, in the upside down land is significant. It could be a significant indication that we're going to see this kind of an action, which is more of distributive action, right, to come back down and test this main trend again. Or it could be that this is more of an SOS style action. We're really just going to get that inverted spring. It's almost identical to what happened here with the widening, and then it drops down, goes a little too low, quote unquote high, right? Goes too low, quote unquote, I mean. It's actually too high, but then ends up reversing and goes the other way in order to get to those lower values. Very similar to what happened back in March in terms of like a breakout module. So it's either like March where you get this distribution, or it's like the major 2020 where you get the reversal here and it's much smaller. If that were to happen, I'm just going to put it out there. I don't want to get too much into this because it's already gone on for really long. This is a long video. But if that were to happen, I think that we'd be looking at something more like a giant wedge. You know what I mean? Because then it would be like literally like a micro version of this that occurred. And so if that were the case, you know, so many things could happen, but this could end up becoming like a humongously long, you know what I mean? Like falling wedge type deal, where this is like a secondary distribution. So it's like a UT and then a UTAD. And I'm talking about this in reverse land, right? I mean, I could see it now being like very, very similar. Where eventually you do kind of break the mold, but it takes a long time to get there. And I think a lot of folks, you know, we look at this upside down as like, oh yeah, that's totally possible. But a lot of folks might look at that and say, yeah, it seems pretty reasonable. Because eventually, you know, once you kind of explore these lows repeatedly, if you get those buy-ins, this is that long-term bounce, just like we had here. And then you get another long-term bounce, you know, and you're getting those buy-ins really low. We're talking about down into like the 5s and 4s, and then eventually break out, you know, and you at that point, I think it's way in the future, again, 2025. But a lot of that is very similar to what Adam Aaron has said about his longer-term plan. And so if he's doing all these like fundraising things in the next couple of years still, you may take that long, right, to get to that point. And then you've got this kind of massive argument for like a huge move, right, long term. So it's still predominantly bearish up until this point. And then you've got this massive potential right here to move back up to either the top, right, or to break out again and have a very similar run back to all-time highs. And I think it's a pretty strong argument that could be made that that could be what happens as well. So I'm like not 100% sure of anything here. I'm saying that right now it's posited to get you down to, looks like it could come down on this channel to $1 right around earnings. I think it's very possible that this reverses and comes back up to 45 by early next year. But it has to be first 14, then hold 11, and that's it. So no matter what happens over the next few weeks, I'm going to keep you kind of updated on this particular chart. If you turn into any of the streams or if you're in the Discord, I know this was a long video. I understand a lot of people aren't going to watch the whole thing. If you did watch it all, I appreciate you. Appreciate you taking the time. I think it's an interesting video. Hopefully you guys thought it was interesting. Maybe it gave you some different perspective on especially these guys, like these major retests, you know, here and here. I think those are really critical. And ultimately, you know, when we get to sort of like where does the rubber meet the road kind of stuff, I think a lot of it is going to have to do with these guys. And so I would be keenly watching to sort of see, where did they go? It disappeared. I was going to draw it out real nice. I would be keenly watching these particular levels to see what happens over the next year or so. And I think that the main purpose of this, again, is not to create like fear or doubt or FOMO or anything, but the main purpose is to just share with you my thoughts on what I think is very likely to happen based on everything we know, right? And I do think that there's a strong chance that either one of these situations could pan out. I like this one a little better. Obviously I want it to come back up, but I think that there is a decent enough chance. That's why I wanted to share it. Okay, that this is possible. And I do believe that it has to do with the main creek going from December through basically the tops in September of 2020, December of 2016 to the top in 2020, and it's really pretty far down there. So for right now, that's all I'm going to do. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you later.